These are notes 18.1 Counterculture of the 1960s, or the hippies of the 60s. When we look at the counterculture of the 1960s, we kind of look back at what made it a counterculture. The definition of a counterculture is a culture within the mainstream culture that is opposite of it. If it's just a culture that's apart, so like you could have like a a culture of a certain regional area, or even like think of like tribes or things like that that can have a certain type of culture within the mainstream culture. We would call that like a subculture. Like the Western culture is a subculture within mainstream culture. But a counterculture is the opposite of mainstream, like they oppose mainstream, which is different than subculture. In the 50s, one of our America's Time videos talked about the beat movement. The beat movement opposed what we call materialism and like buying things. Um, the civil rights movement encouraged marches and like civil disobedience to prove a point, which wasn't typically before the civil rights movement the mode of political change. And overall, we had many of the kids that, um, were born either, born in the baby boomer era or in the mid 40s during the war, um, to begin to question authority. They began to basically not trust anyone over the age of 30. Um, that whole idea of youth and only trusting youth kind of led to this thing called the hippie culture. They had new styles of dress. You can see some of that depicted. To say there's one certain type of dress that's hippie, it is kind of hard to actually define that, because it was varied. But one thing, many times, it would be loose clothing, sometimes almost mismatched. But like the idea of kind of keeping like a free spirit. Music was new, rock and roll, and like some of the folk music of like Bob Dylan that also was a part of the hippie culture. More recreational use of drugs, so using a variety of drugs that was a big part of the hippie culture. We had during this time a generation gap, so many of the older people, didn't support the hippie culture or long hair or, a change of clothing, a use of drugs. Many of them that were that older generation had fought in World War II, and they were what sometimes called the greatest generation, um, and they were traditional, and so they didn't support many of the things that the hippie culture did. But in that, you see like where young people, as they become adults, become there's this gap where they don't communicate, and um, so we kind of have this change where the old and young kind of pursue two different separate cultures or even goals. See a huge change in politics here, uh, huge change in society overall. The baby boomers were the source of change. Even though some of this started in the early 60s, we see a lot of them, about mid 60s, about 1965, 67, where we see like the large portion of them. Um, that means that, if even though we typically call the baby boomers the 1950s, it could be that, the father came home from World War II in 1947 or 48, began having children. By time you get to 65, they're 16, 17, 18 years old, and they're the baby boomers. Tradition and authority, everything from police officers to churches, was, um, rejected in the counterculture. When we look at this, a lot of them was like, um, do your own thing, whatever feels good, do it. Things like that were a lot of the quotes that the counterculture promoted. The nation was very prosperous, So, because of the prosperity of the 50s, many of these baby boomer generations didn't have to work as teenagers like their fathers and mothers had during the Great Depression. So, they didn't have the same um, appreciation for tradition or authority. So many of them could do political activism or oppose war um, because they didn't really have to have a job. They could either be in college or even still supported by mom and dad, even if mom and dad didn't agree with them. So some of that counterculture is also based in the idea of, um, the ability of prosperity, which allows parents, to take care of their children even into after adulthood. Another change of the counterculture for this generation was the Beatles. So we kind of look at the art overall, even though there was a ton of art, like change in art, change in music, we can look at a few that really changes the scope. So like the Beatles really changed the scope of rock music overall. Um, they not only encourage more like what we would call boy bands, but they also um, were one that kind of promoted this new style of music and new style of culture. Even people that like folk musicians like Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, a lot of Bob Dylan songs, are protest war, very much, the hippie idea of love and peace and no war. Um, but even him were impacted by the Beatles and changed some of their sound just based on some of the things they heard from the Beatles themselves. Because of the Beatles, we began to have, after that, a big change in the music, the way it sounded, the types of bands. It kind of leaves the Elvis Presley sound and kind of goes into what is like the precursor to the 70s rock bands. Um, Sexual revolution. Anyone over the age of 30 would be more opposed to premarital sex than anyone under the age of 30. So most of this was a huge change, not only in being more okay with premarital sex, but also being okay with open discussion in mainstream media. Things that were never talked about before now become something that's a part of a television program. We also see the use of communes. So they would be like small communities where people would share all their resources. So whether it's food or whether it's um, you know cleaning supplies or whatever, they had no set like what we would consider like core families or even core relationships where you would have couples. It really wasn't like that. It was just kind of a commune. We really see this like for a period of time with the hippies, but like we still see it once in a while today. Um, Most of the time, communes are related to things like the Hutterites, which is more of like a religious group that focuses on more of a commune. Um, but at this time, it was a part of the hippie culture. So there was two um, there was a main area. What you hear a lot about Woodstock, and that was one festival that lasted a long time. Um, but we also find an entire area of San Francisco that becomes basically like kind of like a hippie hub. It's called the Hot uh, Ashbury district of San Francisco. This area of San Francisco, the businesses, the parks, everything kind of turned into the center of the counterculture. They had used a lot of drugs in this area. They had a lot of unconventional clothing. Rock music and political speakers were kind of a part of it. People lived everywhere in parks and buildings. It just kind of was like a free for all, I guess you could kind of say. A lot of them are going to like leave the traditional Judeo-Christian values and begin to explore things like Buddhism, Eastern religions that focus on nature worship. Some of them like spending time out in the forest or in national forest as a part of some type of like religious ceremony. These royal these a lot even outside of San Francisco, we have um, a lot of rural nature worship communes. So some of them they would like move out to rural areas, almost kind of like a tribe, I guess you could say. They would live off the land. They would, grow their own vegetables. Some of them would even live on beaches in California, random places. One thing we find in this district of San Francisco, it was um, very popular at first. A lot of them were actually encouraged to use drugs because it would like make them enter higher parts of their mind. They also encouraged them to like tune in, turn on to drugs, and drop out, which is like of mainstream society. Even though like it got a lot of media attention in San Francisco, in the end, they began to have high rates of drug abuse, as like drugs like heroin and others that began to cause major problems in this area, which obviously drug abuse also leads to crime. One of the real big negative effects that we talk about is the drug overdoses and addictions and violence. So in the beginning, the purpose of the hippie movement was all about peace and love, but some of the most too like especially like rock musicians, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, they're going to die of drug overdoses in their early 20s, and that's going to have a pretty profound effect on the hippie movement overall, not only famous people, but also others that are just friends that die of overdoses. Um, we also find that violence of the rock and roll movement begins to have a part of it. So, like if we think of there was a case where the Rolling Stones were playing at a music festival. Probably, I think either 69 or 70, and Hell's Angels were actually hired for private security, and they ended up stabbing a black man that approached the stage. Well, many of the like the hardcore believers of the hippie movement really felt like that this was, this is practically like not what we started this for. We didn't start it for violence. It seemed like most people were part of the hippie movement for, the drugs and the free love more than it was about like peace, love, and changing the world. And so basically, at the core of the values of the hippie movement, it falls apart within a few years. Honestly, the height of the hippie movement was probably about 5 years. Was there people that were hippies for 10 years, 15 years? Yeah, there's still people that are hippies today. That doesn't change. Um, Most hippies abandoned the social experiment. It was like something they did when they were young. They experimented and they moved on. Most of them went right back into society. But what it did change is it changed politics because those ideas of whether it's freer of a sexual revolution or freer of drugs or whatever, influenced the changes that came, especially like with the Chicano movement, with the women's rights movement of the 70s, kind of changes that. Some of them went right back into mainstream society, become bankers and real estate agents. And honestly, if you don't have pictures from that time period, you probably wouldn't know that they had been a part of a hippie movement. Sometimes it was just a summertime thing for a college student. Um, Overall, we still see the influence of the counterculture because not only did it change music and culture, but it also changed the political viewpoints. And the overall anti-war movement changed the way that the government dealt with the Vietnam War. So it does have a profound effect on modern America. And that's the end of 18.1 notes.